Hey folks, how's everybody doing today? Hope you're all well out there. It is Valentine's Day, folks, while I'm recording this, so I'm clearly ignoring my wife because I love all of you. This is your AP history teacher, world history teacher, Osborne, trying to learn you a little something about the American Revolution here together. So hopefully that will be something interesting. Well, not just the American, also the French Revolution as well. So this is the third part of this little slideshow that we're going through. You'll notice I'm not in the corner as normal. I chose to do this just because it's a little easier for me to set up sometimes. I'm going to do this for a couple of videos, and then we'll just see kind of how y'all feel about it. If y'all really want me to be in the corner, I can certainly do that. It also allows me to use a slightly better microphone, which helps out. So hopefully you can hear the recording quality a little bit better. You'll probably also hear my dog or something in the background, but whatever. Hey, listen, we are talking today. I split this up a little bit. So the first part was about the Enlightenment, and then we're going to do some Enlightenment-based revolutions. So this little video here will be about 20 minutes, and we'll do the American and French Revolution. And then the next one will be about the Haitian, the Latin American Revolution, and some other small stuff too. So anyway, this is all stuff that's related to Unit 5. This is going to be 5.2, which is a real big section for some reason. So we'll have to get through that as best we can. But when we're talking about this, don't forget that this is all kind of connected, though, right? The Enlightenment is heavily connected to the American Revolution, as is the French Revolution is also connected to the American Revolution and also to the Enlightenment as well. So these are all connected together. The Enlightenment is going to give all these folks like a lot of incentive to change things, to live their best life, change around their perspective a little bit, all of that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and get into it. Oops, I prefaced that a little bit too early. Let's go here. So a lot of people around the world were inspired by the Enlightenment, as it says here, and these folks want to get rid of these oppressive regimes. One of the first ones to do so is America, and that's not because anything too particular. It's mostly just as a result of a couple of incidents that are taking place. So the Enlightenment is actually probably more popular in places like Britain and France. It's just that America has a couple of things that are going to lead them to do this kind of stuff first. One thing to remember about the American Revolution always is that economic freedoms and desire for local rule are going to be what contributes to the American Revolution. So this is not a social revolution in any way. If you think about how England and America are structured when America is still a colony, you basically have this pyramid, and at the very top is going to be the king and the queen and the lords and all these kind of folks, and then the next level down is going to be a group of kind of like economic gentry, like people who own land and stuff like that, and then you get your sort of free people, your lower people, then all the way down to the slaves at the bottom. That is before the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, you essentially just take the top off that pyramid, right? The local elites are going to stay exactly the same. There's no change here for social situations. We'll see this also with the Latin American Revolution as well. It's not the same for French or the Haitian revolutions. But the biggest difference for the American Revolution and its outcome is political and economic. It will change the nature of the political structure. So, of course, we don't have a king. We have presidents and Congress and all that kind of stuff. And also economic changes as America chooses to change things from what they actually were under the British. So they're going to cast off mercantilism and move more towards capitalism as well. But what's going to spur all this? Well, there's obviously all the stuff we'll talk about in a second about tea parties and so forth. But one of the biggest factors that contributes to this is a war. So there's a war between Britain and France. It's called the 7 Years' War. It was fought a little bit before this. It's I think the 1760s. And in America, the American portion of this war is called the French and Indian War. Now, the 7 Years' War is probably like World War .5, not quite World War One, but it is a huge scale. Like they fight the French in India, they fight the French in the Americas, they fight the French on the continent. It's this huge conflict around the world. But at the end of this conflict, Britain is going to win. The problem with this, though, is it's extremely expensive. And so the British government is like, look, we paid a lot of money for you. We kept you safe from French and Native American attacks. Like, we want you to contribute back to your own defense. And of course, America, in true American fashion, said, heck no, brother. So let's take a look here, a little picture here. This is, of course, our Tea Party friends. This took place in Boston, and we, for some reason, I have no idea why, the people who participated decided to dress up like Native Americans, and so that's what they did. And they dumped all this tea into the harbor. This tea had actually been there for quite a while because it had been impounded. It was more of a political stunt than anything else. Again, as I mentioned, to pay for this conflict, Britain is going to increase tax collection and are also going to pass a few new taxes. Now, mostly it's not that they're passing a whole bunch of new taxes. Mostly it's just that they were like enforcing taxes they had before. Prior to this period, England had a policy towards America called salutary neglect, which means basically let's not work too hard to get our taxes back. Like the problem is that to enforce taxes, if you want to enforce it, you have to pay a lot of money to get people to pay your taxes. It's far away, all this kind of stuff. They were pretty happy with just having all of these supplies and things coming over instead, which is going to feed mercantilism. So they were okay with the kind of situation that they were in. However, when they start to actually try to pay back the French and Indian War, they choose to enforce those taxes. So it's not so much that America was getting a whole bunch of brand new taxes. It's more that they were asking us to pay taxes that we already owed them, and we said no. Also, a number of the sort of elites are also people who benefited from these. Like I think it's Sam Adams, for example, was like a smuggler and stuff. So some of those folks, the leaders of the position, get upset as well. There are also a couple new taxes passed, though. But the colonists get pretty upset. They actually repeal some of these taxes, but leave a few in place. Specifically, the Tax Act of 1773 is going to lead to a lot of uprisings and unhappy Americans, which leads to that Boston Tea Party that we just saw a picture of. July 4th, 1776, of course, revolution is going to break out with the Declaration of Independence. It's heavily Enlightenment-focused. And war will follow afterwards. Now, this war, we're not going to go into too much detail here for it, but the United States barely wins. We mostly lose a lot of the battles, but sort of win the overarching thing to it, because we just make it so that it's just not helpful for the British to win. Like we're just beating them down, basically. The English are just having to pay all this money and stuff. Not to mention that there's a number of people in the Parliament who agree with us. Not to mention that we win a couple of battles, so that's going to help us out. The French are also going to help us out. Again, kind of getting back at the English, so that's going to help as well. They had been inspired by the Enlightenment as well as all these other things too. The last battle of this war is going to take place at Yorktown in Virginia in 1781. This guy, Lord Cornwallis, will surrender to George Washington. Now, it takes a while for them to choose what to do exactly. So this peace treaty is in 1783, actually. So it takes a couple of years to actually kind of hammer everything out. The British are stubborn about it. But we have recognized independence from Britain then. In 1789, then, we will create the Constitution with Enlightenment principles. Now, you may notice that's a good 6 years between the end of the war, or the peace treaty, and 1789. What do we do in the meantime? Well, we had something called the Articles of Confederation, which was our first attempt at a government, and it fails pretty bad because we went from a very centralized government under a king. We did not want that again, so we had a very weak government. But that weak government was really not up to the challenges that they needed. So there's a couple different sort of small-scale rebellions. The government can't do anything about them. And so in 1789, a number of people will meet together and debate over issues related to the Constitution. James Madison, for example, will be a big factor there. And when they come out with this new Constitution, it has a number of really important things to it, such as separation of powers, so different parts of the government will be separate, branches of government, a federalist system between the states and the federal government, all the stuff that we know today. These are all sort of Enlightenment ideals. They basically just debate all these concepts to try to come up with something kind of brand new. It's like the first workshop. They're like workshopping everything to see what's going to happen. Now, the French Revolution, on the other hand, is going to be a civil war. So this is very much unlike America. It is going to challenge the basic social structure of the country. It demands an end to absolutism under the French king. And the French are inspired by the American Revolution. So two things are really going to kind of lead to this. One is this inspiration, like a lot of people in France were like, well, if the Americans can do this kind of stuff, maybe we can too. But the other big factor is that because the French helped us, they were in a lot of debt. They had borrowed a lot of money to finance their navy and things to help out the Americans. So thumbing their nose at the British and trying to help out the Americans was not particularly beneficial to their tax structure. And so the problem then is that the king needs to generate tax money. He needs to raise cash, but he has a hard time doing so at this point. So in England, they have this parliament that helps the king sort of regulate taxes and stuff. He goes to them and talks about problems. They, get concessions potentially from him, and he can then get some money generated from that. They don't really have this in France because of the absolutist structure. So while the king could simply just put some more taxes out, he really risks like widespread discontent. The nobles are going to be mad. Maybe they're going to kick him out and bring somebody else in to be the king and so forth. So he has this idea that why don't we go ahead and call this group that is sort of a parliament. This group is called the Estates General. It had met previously in the Middle Ages and stuff. It had been quite a while since it had met again. But basically it consists of different social classes of France. So it's going to be the nobility, it's going to be the clergy, and it'll sort of be like the merchant kind of people as well. So these estates are going to meet together, and the idea that he has is we're going to meet, I'm going to be like, hey, y'all, I need some money. And they're going to be like, okay, cool, here's some money. And then he's going to dissolve them, and everyone's going to be happy. But of course, the problem then is that they realize that they have the king over a barrel. And so in 1789, they decide that they would like to be like a legit real parliament, right? So they start to do that kind of stuff. The king actually locks them out of Versailles. They go to a tennis court on the grounds and make this sort of pledge that they will meet together and try to be a real parliament and so forth. So after this, then, we're going to have a series of riots and marches that are going to take place all across France and in Paris in particular. There will be a storming of the Bastille where they will attempt to free some political prisoners. There were only 9 people in it, so it wasn't really that bad, but it's sort of a symbol that they're going to, take over and kind of kick the king out and get rid of these problems. And so what happens then is that this group that was formerly the Estates General, it will end up having a ton of different names. So, Legislative Assembly, National Assembly, all this kind of stuff. We're going to call it the National Assembly, and if you call it that on the test, it'll be fine. But just so you know. So it's called basically the National Assembly, and they will call for the execution of the king and queen in 1793, and they will go to the guillotine. So here's an image of the storming of the Bastille. So you can see, again, this is the infamous prison of the French monarchs. But again, at this time period, it actually isn't that bad because of a variety of reasons. But it will serve as a major point. It is still a major, major holiday in France. All right, so the French then will write a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, which proclaimed freedom of thought and affirmed natural rights. Now, the problem, though, is that this is not all sunny and happy. There's an issue of well, what do we do? How do we organize a new government? How are we gonna handle this? So the National Assembly, which again sort of changes its name over times, ends up having a number of different political parties, and those parties go from okay to pretty radical. So what happens basically is there's 2 groups, the Jacobins or Jacobins, who are going to stress Enlightenment thought, and then another group of king's supporters, basically. Now, after the king is executed, they are not exactly that anymore. They're kind of like the conservative branch. So we have 2 different groups here. Jacobins are going to be the ones who are more Enlightenment-focused and quote-unquote progressive, and the king supporters will be a bit more conservative. But the problem, though, is that even within the Jacobins, there are people who disagree with each other. So the Jacobins then will split up into 2 different groups also. They're still all under the idea of the Jacobins, but there will be 2 different groups. Now, I'm going to mess up this French pronunciation, but one is the Girondins, and the other is the Montagnards, which is the mountain. So the mountain is a radical faction, and that is under this guy named Maximilien Robespierre. So the mountain will gain control of the Legislative Assembly, the National Assembly, excuse me, and they will basically proceed to run the country as sort of a little dictatorship. There's a few of them in this kind of small committee, and they basically will start just chopping heads off. And this becomes known as the Reign of Terror. Reign of Terror lasts from about 1793 until 1794, and is pretty bad. They end up guillotining a whole lot of people over time. This will, however, lead to nationalism. People start to think of themselves as French. In the wake of the Reign of Terror, France was in a lot of trouble, though. They were at war with Austria because Austria was where Marie Antoinette came from, and she had been executed by the French government. Other powers also that were very conservative were also really unhappy with all this stuff. And while the revolutionary forces did okay, by this time the political regime, which was called the Directory, was pretty weak. So the Directory is sort of like the sub-group that was running the country in addition to the National Assembly. Here's just an example of sort of what happens during this time period. It doesn't work out very well. 1789, we got the Revolution. We had the period of the National Assembly till 1792. Then this thing called the National Convention, which is when the Reign of Terror takes place. We see the rise of Napoleon from 1795 until 1799. This is when the Directory is running. Then we have the Consulate, which is under Napoleon. Napoleon declares himself emperor in 1804. He loses twice, 1813 and 1815. Then we have a upping of the kings. They have a new king come in. So Charles the 18th and Louis the 18th and Charles the 10th come in as kings. We have a guy, the Bourbon kings. There's a revolution in 1830. They replace those Bourbon kings with a new monarchy under what are called the Orleanist factions under Louis Philippe. However, there's another revolution. You're sensing a pattern here. And this guy, Louis Napoleon, who is the nephew of Napoleon, comes in, and he will declare himself Emperor Napoleon III until he is defeated in 1791, in which case they will become a republic. That'll be, I believe, the Third Republic at that time. So French history is pretty chaotic in this time period, as is quite clear. All right, now let's talk a little bit about Napoleon, though. So this is kind of a real short version of him. We may end up going into some more detail later, but I just want to make sure you know who this guy is. He's kind of not exactly a Unit 5, but I don't really know anyone else to talk about him, so it just works to put him here. So Napoleon himself is kind of an unlikely leader of France. He is from Corsica, which is sort of not technically French. It's kind of Italian French. But he's also not that aristocratic. Like, he's kind of like a high-level gentry person, right? He would never been strong under the monarchy, but he's able to seize control under the consulate in 1799. So after he ends up taking control of the government, he ends up winning battles. People talk a lot about how genius of a military leader he was, but it's kind of hard to really to understand just how much. Like, he's like one of the greatest of all time. Like, he just beats everyone. Like, he wins almost every single battle he ever fights. The ones he loses are pretty close, until obviously like Waterloo, and then here in Russia, as we'll talk about. He is just an extraordinary military general. But he keeps winning until his defeat in Russia in 1812. Basically, they just weren't really well prepared. Like, he takes Moscow, so he's successful in that sense, but he just can't hold it, really. The Allies then sort of attack him, and they take Paris in 1814. He is exiled because that's kind of how you do things back then. You don't, like, execute the king, because that sort of reinforces the French Revolution. So instead, he is exiled for a while. He returns what's called the 100 Days, and then he is defeated at Waterloo. He is very popular in France, though, even to this day. He repealed sort of the worst excesses of the Reign of Terror. He's going to reverse the attacks on the church, so there was a lot of attacks on the church in the Revolutionary period. And he will also confirm religious rights. So one of his biggest accomplishments, though, is the Napoleonic Code. This code today actually has a lot of influence in French-speaking countries and even in America. One of our states, Louisiana, operates on a law system based on the Napoleonic Code. So it's kind of confusing. If you're a lawyer, you really have to do a lot more there. There's the famous picture of him with his hand in his whatever that is, waistcoat or whatever. You can see here all the different battles that he's fighting over time. So the red little dots there are victories, of course. Leipzig, Austerlitz, Borodino at 1812. He really kind of just loses Waterloo as far as his big, huge battles that he's going to lose. So pretty successful person there. All right, a little bit here on the aftermath of this. As we sort of already saw, this Congress of Vienna is going to decide to restore what's called the balance of power. So the problem is that if you're conservatives and you don't want to change a whole lot of stuff, what do you do when you take over and there's this guy who's been changing everything? Well, you can't just go back to the old ways. And so what they do is, you can go back to the old ways. So what they decide to do is restore this idea of a balance of power. So France will lose territory. That will lead to what's known as the encirclement of France. So they're going to empower the Netherlands and Italy and places. And that will help keep France in check is the idea. So they're going to shuffle some of these holdings. They'll restore the French monarchy. And as we saw before, eventually that monarchy is overthrown by Napoleon III. And he will have a defeated 1871 and a republic will return. And so I think we're in the Fifth Republic right now for France. All right, here's sort of what it looks like after all that. You can see France there and the German Confederation. So again, they're going to try to empower Germany a little bit. Austria, Prussia, these countries are going to be made stronger and gain a little bit of territory. But you can see France there basically is sort of the modern day version of France. It's le hexagon, sort of hexagonal shaped. All right, well, that is where we will end this little video. We'll continue on with the next section where we'll talk about a couple more revolutions, including Haiti, Latin America, and a few other things. hopefully this was interesting to you and you got a little bit out of it. Again, we move kind of fast through some of this stuff. If you have more questions, feel free to let me know. And I hope y'all are doing well, folks. All right, that is what we got going on.